The Equalizer 3 is not simply another chapter in the story of Robert McCall, the almost mythic vigilante who can walk into a room, study every detail, calculate every threat, and turn ordinary objects into instruments of punishment. At first glance, that is exactly what this movie promises. There is a criminal organization, there are innocent people being terrorized, and there is Denzel Washington standing in the middle of it all with the unnerving calm of a man who already knows how the story is going to end. But beneath that familiar machinery is a much quieter question. What happens when a man who has spent his entire life being useful as a weapon finally becomes tired of being one? That contradiction is what gives The Equalizer 3 its unusual emotional weight. Robert McCall wants peace, but violence follows him almost everywhere. He wants to disappear, yet injustice has a way of finding him. He dreams of ordinary life while possessing extraordinary skills that make ordinary life almost impossible. Even when he is sitting quietly, eating a meal, reading a book, watching strangers from across a room, there is a sense that another part of his mind is always calculating. Who is dangerous? Who is vulnerable? What is happening behind that door? What is that person hiding? McCall does not simply observe the world. He scans it. And when he finally acts, the transformation is disturbing because of how little emotion he appears to need. He does not rage. He does not scream. He does not celebrate. He simply decides that someone must be stopped, and then the room seems to become a mathematical equation. Distance, timing, leverage, objects, exits, weaknesses. Everything has a purpose. The opening Sicilian sequence immediately establishes that methodology. Before the audience even understands exactly what McCall is doing there, the film makes it clear that this is a man operating on a level far beyond the criminals surrounding him. He moves through the isolated property with patience rather than panic, observing the environment and allowing the enemy to reveal itself. The violence that follows is brutal, but what makes it unsettling is not merely the amount of blood. It is the intimacy of the killing. McCall gets close enough to see the consequences of every decision. There is nothing glamorous about the physical reality of what he does. And that matters because McCall is no longer the invulnerable action hero he once appeared to be. His body is older. His movements carry accumulated consequences. When the film eventually shows him seriously wounded, the image changes everything. The man who seemed almost supernatural suddenly looks mortal. His skills remain frighteningly precise, but his body can no longer hide the cost of using them. So why does he keep doing it? That question sits underneath nearly every violent moment in The Equalizer 3. Is McCall helping people because he genuinely believes in justice, or because helping people is the only way he knows how to live with himself? Is he protecting victims, or punishing himself through the protection of others? And perhaps most importantly, can a person spend decades becoming something destructive and then simply decide to become something else? The movie's Italian setting offers an unexpected possibility. After the bloodshed of the opening, McCall eventually finds himself in a small coastal community that seems almost designed to contradict everything about him. There are cafes, restaurants, churches, narrow streets, old buildings, families, conversations, food, and people who know each other. Life happens publicly. People sit together. They argue, work, eat, and laugh in the same spaces. Nobody appears to be waiting for a government operation or preparing for a tactical assault. This is not McCall's world. And yet, almost immediately, it feels like it could become one. That is the central irony of the Equalizer 3. McCall is not really searching for another mission. He is searching for somewhere where he can finally stop being McCall the assassin. The criminal organization threatening this town eventually becomes the obvious external enemy, but the deeper conflict is happening inside the protagonist. Can violence become something other than destruction when it is used to protect? Can an assassin create peace without becoming addicted to the process of creating it? The movie does not answer those questions with philosophical speeches. Instead, it lets McCall's behavior answer them gradually. He watches people. He listens. He eats. He recovers. He becomes familiar with faces. He notices what the town is losing. And slowly, almost against his own intentions, these strangers stop being strangers. That is why the small Italian community matters more than any government operation McCall has ever been involved in. For the first time, he is not simply saving a person long enough to disappear again. He is protecting a place he might actually want to remain inside. The Equalizer 3 therefore works best when we stop asking only how many criminals McCall can defeat and start asking what all that violence is doing to the man performing it. The gunfire, broken bones and calculated executions are still there, and the movie absolutely understands the cathartic pleasure of watching Denzel Washington dismantle people who believe they are untouchable. But the brutality carries a strange sadness because McCall increasingly resembles a man who has become exceptionally good at the one thing he no longer wants to be. That is where the story becomes more intimate than its premise suggests. The real enemy is not simply the Camorra. It is the possibility that McCall may never know how to live without the violence that has defined him. And if that is true, then the final confrontation is never going to be only about defeating a criminal kingpin. It has to answer a much more personal question. After a lifetime spent moving from one crisis to another, can Robert McCall finally find a place that does not need him to be a weapon? The answer begins with understanding why this third film feels different from the two that came before it. Part 1, Hook Opening. The Equalizer trilogy begins with a very recognizable idea. Robert McCall sees something wrong, decides that the people responsible have crossed a line, and then uses an almost frightening level of intelligence and violence to restore some kind of balance. The formula is simple because McCall himself is simple on the surface. He is quiet. He is observant. He has a strict personal code. He does not look like a conventional action hero, and that is precisely why Denzel Washington's performance works so well. Washington never plays McCall as someone trying to prove that he is dangerous. He plays him as someone who already knows exactly what he is capable of. That confidence changes the rhythm of the action. Most action heroes announce themselves through movement. McCall often announces himself through stillness. He can sit at a table while everyone around him is behaving normally, and yet the audience understands that he is mentally measuring the room. The tension comes from knowing that something is about to happen long before the people around him realize they are in danger. The Equalizer 3 immediately exploits that tension. Its opening sequence is almost a declaration of franchise identity. Here is McCall entering a criminal environment where everyone believes they control the situation. He does not need an army. He does not need elaborate technology. He needs observation, timing, and the willingness to act. But the film also places a subtle warning inside that spectacle. McCall is getting older. That fact is easy to overlook because Denzel Washington's screen presence remains so commanding. Even when McCall is physically weakened, the character retains an almost supernatural authority. But the Equalizer 3 is increasingly interested in the distance between what McCall's mind can do and what his body can survive. The opening violence therefore becomes more than an action demonstration. It becomes a reminder that every victory costs him something. This is especially important because McCall's killings are rarely presented as emotionally explosive. He does not lose control. He controls himself almost completely. That makes his violence strangely intimate. We watch him make decisions with the calmness of someone arranging objects on a table, and the absence of emotional chaos makes the brutality harder to dismiss as simple revenge. The audience may enjoy it. The film knows we enjoy it. There is a deeply satisfying fantasy in watching a corrupt person finally meet someone who cannot be intimidated, bribed, or manipulated. But the Equalizer 3 keeps asking us to notice the uncomfortable side of that fantasy. McCall is incredibly good at violence because violence is the language he has spent most of his life learning. And perhaps he has become too fluent in it. That tension follows him into Italy. The town he discovers is almost the opposite of the environments in which McCall usually operates. Instead of government conspiracies, criminal warehouses, or anonymous urban streets, there are open squares, restaurants, old churches, balconies, sunlight, and people whose problems are painfully ordinary. They are trying to run businesses. They are trying to feed their families. They are trying to live. McCall begins as an outsider looking in. That distinction becomes crucial. He is accustomed to entering someone else's world, solving a problem and leaving. He is not accustomed to becoming part of the world he protects. The longer he remains in this town, the harder that old pattern becomes. The movie therefore creates a curiosity that has very little to do with whether McCall will beat the Camorra. We already know he probably will. The franchise has trained us to expect it. The more interesting question is why this particular place affects him differently. Why does this town matter? Why do these people matter? Why does a man who has spent his life disappearing begin to imagine staying? The answer is hidden in the smallest moments. A meal shared. A conversation. A familiar face behind a counter. A doctor treating him not as a legendary operative but as an injured human being. A street that begins to feel familiar. McCall is slowly being introduced to something that violence can never provide by itself: belonging. That is why the action in The Equalizer 3 carries a different emotional texture. The violence is still the attraction, but it is no longer the entire point. Every time McCall chooses to fight, the audience is encouraged to think about what he is fighting for. He is not simply removing criminals. He is trying to protect the possibility of ordinary life. And that distinction changes how we understand the Equalizer himself. The title suggests balance, but perhaps McCall's greatest imbalance is within his own identity. He knows how to punish. He knows how to calculate. He knows how to survive. What he does not know is how to simply belong. That is the journey this film quietly builds beneath its revenge thriller surface. The first two films establish McCall as a man who moves toward danger because he cannot tolerate injustice. The third begins asking what happens when the danger is located in a place he actually wants to call home. And to understand why that question matters, we have to look at the larger story surrounding the character, the filmmaker who shaped his cinematic identity, and the expectations audiences brought into this final chapter. The Equalizer had already become more than a title by this point. It had become a particular kind of action fantasy, a mature man, a precise code, a terrifying skill set, and a world full of people who believe consequences only apply to other people. Robert McCall exists to correct that assumption. But The Equalizer 3 adds something new to the equation. It gives him something to lose. Part 2. Context Background. The character of Robert McCall did not begin with Denzel Washington. The concept originated in the television series The Equalizer, where the central idea was already built around a mysterious former operative using his skills to help people who could not protect themselves. What the films changed was the scale, the physicality and, most importantly, the personality of the character. Denzel Washington transformed McCall from a television vigilante into a cinematic presence built around restraint. He did not need to imitate the traditional action hero. In fact, the franchise works partly because he does the opposite. McCall rarely behaves like someone seeking attention. His power comes from his ability to remain calm while everyone else becomes emotional. The first film established that identity with remarkable efficiency. McCall appeared to be living a quiet life, but his past remained close beneath the surface. The story eventually forced him back into violence, and the appeal of the character became clear. He was not fighting because he enjoyed chaos. He was fighting because he could not watch vulnerable people be destroyed by people who believed they were untouchable. The second film expanded that idea and pushed McCall further into the role of protector. But a third installment faced a difficult problem. The franchise already had a formula. Another group of criminals could be introduced, another innocent victim could be endangered, and McCall could once again calculate exactly how to dismantle the people responsible. The question was whether repeating that formula would still mean anything. Several years passed between the second and third films, with development and production timing affected by the broader disruptions that reshaped the film industry. By the time the third movie arrived, audiences had become accustomed to the idea of Denzel Washington as an older action protagonist. But the challenge was not simply making him dangerous again. It was finding a new emotional environment for that danger. Southern Italy provided exactly that. Moving McCall away from the urban environments associated with the earlier films allowed the filmmakers to change the emotional temperature of the franchise. The location is not merely decorative. It becomes part of the story's psychology. The narrow streets, old architecture, warm sunlight, coastal views, and public spaces create an image of a life that feels slower and more communal than the worlds McCall usually inhabits. That difference matters. A city can allow a person to disappear. A small town does the opposite. People notice when someone is absent. They notice when a stranger returns to the same cafe. They remember faces. They know each other's routines. For a man whose survival has depended on remaining anonymous, that is both comforting and dangerous. Antoine Fuqua's return as director was therefore important because he already understood the particular rhythm of McCall's world. Fuqua does not need every scene to explode. He understands that suspense can exist inside silence. A man sitting at a table can be more threatening than a man holding a gun if the audience knows what that man is capable of. Richard Wenk also returned to write the screenplay, preserving the character's fundamental voice and habits. McCall's rituals remain central: his observation, his timing, his counting, his books, his food, and his almost obsessive need to understand the people around him. The action itself is designed around those qualities. McCall does not fight like a young superhero. His movements are economical. He uses the environment. He lets other people's aggression become their weakness. The emphasis is not on athletic spectacle but on precision. That makes the aging protagonist believable within the film's mythology. McCall may not be able to move like a 20-year-old, but he does not need to. His advantage is that he has spent decades learning exactly where to stand, when to move, and how much force is necessary. Italy also allows the film to become something between a crime thriller, a western, and a character drama. McCall arrives from outside. A community is being controlled by a powerful criminal force. The locals are afraid. An outsider begins to intervene. The familiar shape of the Western is unmistakable. But instead of a dusty American frontier, the frontier here is a sunlit Italian town. Instead of a young gunslinger, there is an aging assassin. And instead of seeking money or revenge, McCall appears to be searching for a reason to stay. That shift gives the production its most important creative advantage. The filmmakers do not have to invent an entirely new character. They only have to place the existing character somewhere that exposes something previously hidden. And that is exactly what the Italian setting does. Before the film was released, however, audiences already knew what they were buying. They knew the Equalizer formula. They knew Denzel Washington. They knew Antoine Fuqua. They knew that McCall was going to hurt people, probably very badly, and that he would do it with an almost absurd degree of efficiency. The trailers leaned into that expectation. McCall versus the Mafia was an immediately understandable premise. The Italian setting provided visual freshness, while Washington's presence promised continuity. Then there was Dakota Fanning. Her reunion with Washington carried an emotional association with Man on Fire, a film that had become an important reference point for audiences who remembered Washington in another role as a damaged protector. The casting did not require the new film to reproduce that earlier relationship. The nostalgia existed simply because the two actors shared screen history. That history added another layer of expectation. Could The Equalizer 3 feel like a final chapter? Could it give McCall something more than another list of enemies? Could an action franchise about an aging vigilante actually end on an emotional note? The marketing naturally emphasized the spectacle. That is understandable. Explosions, executions, and Denzel Washington staring down criminals are easier to sell than a philosophical argument about belonging. But the finished film is more interested in the quieter promise. It is not really asking whether McCall can win. It is asking what winning means when the person doing the winning is exhausted. That distinction becomes important once the story actually begins. Part 3, Story Recap. The Equalizer 3 opens far from the peaceful Italian community that will eventually become McCall's emotional destination. He is at an isolated Sicilian winery, a place that appears beautiful from the outside but contains the machinery of criminal power within it. That contrast immediately establishes one of the movie's recurring ideas: beauty does not guarantee innocence. McCall enters the environment carefully. He does not rush into confrontation. He observes. He studies the property and the people occupying it. His methodology has always depended on understanding the environment before acting, and here that method becomes almost ritualistic. The criminals believe they control the space because they have numbers, weapons, and authority. McCall sees something else. He sees vulnerabilities. The sequence eventually leads him toward Lorenzo Vitali and the criminal hierarchy surrounding the winery. The presence of stolen money and the structure of the operation suggest that McCall has already been investigating what happens here. He is not wandering into violence randomly. He has followed a trail. And then the Equalizer does what the Equalizer does. He begins dismantling the operation. The violence is controlled rather than chaotic. McCall's greatest weapon is not strength but anticipation. He knows that criminals tend to behave predictably when they become frightened. They reach for weapons. They move toward exits. They protect the people they believe have authority over them. Every instinct becomes something McCall can exploit. The result is a sequence that feels almost like a demonstration. This is what he can do. But the movie refuses to leave the scene as a celebration of competence. McCall is badly injured. The consequences of his actions finally become physical. The character who has spent years appearing almost untouchable is suddenly dependent on other people to survive. That vulnerability changes the emotional direction of the story. He eventually encounters Giovanni, a police officer who becomes an unexpected bridge between McCall and the community. The injured stranger is taken toward a small coastal town, where a doctor treats him. And this is where the film begins changing its language. The winery sequence is about control. The town is about connection. McCall arrives not as the most dangerous man in the room but as a patient. He cannot simply calculate his way out of injury. He has to lie still. He has to accept help. He has to allow another human being to care for him. For someone like McCall, that is almost as significant as any fight. The doctor does not know the full history of the man in front of him. He does not need to. He sees someone wounded and treats him as a person. That simple act becomes the first step toward McCall's relationship with the town. He begins observing. There is a cafe. There are restaurants. There are workers. There are families. People move through the streets with routines that have nothing to do with the criminal world McCall knows so well. At first, he remains detached. But the longer he stays, the more he notices. The town is beautiful, yet something is wrong beneath its surface. Businesses are pressured. People behave carefully. The local criminal organization has created an atmosphere where everyone understands the rules without anyone needing to explain them. This is not the kind of violence McCall witnessed at the winery. There are no dramatic assassinations around every corner. Instead, there is economic pressure, intimidation, and fear. That difference matters because it reveals the true nature of the Camorra's power. They do not need to destroy the town physically. They only need to make ordinary life impossible. A restaurant owner can still open the doors, but if criminals demand money, the business is no longer truly free. A shopkeeper can still serve customers, but if refusing the criminal organization brings consequences, then the appearance of normality hides a deeper form of captivity. McCall recognizes this pattern immediately. He has seen predators exploit vulnerable people before. The question is whether he will interfere. At first, he seems determined not to. That decision makes sense. McCall has spent years trying to control his involvement in the world. He knows what happens when he intervenes. Violence follows. Bodies follow. Attention follows. But the town gradually becomes impossible for him to ignore. The people are not abstract victims. They have faces. They speak to him. They feed him. They treat him like someone who belongs there even before he has earned that belonging. The restaurant becomes especially important because food in this movie represents something McCall has rarely had: ordinary participation in life. He is not simply watching people eat. He is sitting among them. That distinction may appear small, but it is one of the most important changes in his character. McCall has always been an observer standing outside the world. Here he begins taking part in it. At the same time, Emma Collins is investigating the criminal network from another direction. Her presence brings institutional justice into the story. McCall operates through personal intervention. Emma works through information, investigation, and official authority. Their paths eventually connect, creating a subtle contrast between two ways of confronting organized crime. Emma needs evidence. McCall needs a reason. And the town gives him one. As McCall recovers physically, his relationship with the community deepens. He meets people such as Giorgio Benucci, whose presence helps establish the town as more than a backdrop. Giorgio represents the ordinary professional who has a place in the community and understands its rhythms. McCall, meanwhile, remains the outsider. But something strange begins happening. He starts to look less like a visitor. The camera sees him sitting in familiar places. He becomes recognizable. People begin expecting him. The town begins becoming part of his routine. And that is precisely when neutrality becomes impossible. The Camorra's influence becomes increasingly visible. Local businesses are pressured to cooperate. Protection money is demanded. Intimidation becomes part of daily life. The criminal organization is not simply stealing money. It is stealing choice. That is the kind of injustice McCall cannot tolerate. His response begins quietly. He does not announce himself. He does not give a speech. He observes the people responsible and begins testing their reactions. This is where his famous counting methodology becomes important. McCall's counting is not just a cool character quirk. It reflects how he organizes chaos. Time gives him control. Counting turns fear into sequence. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by the violence around him, he reduces it to measurable decisions. When McCall confronts criminals, he rarely needs to raise his voice. His silence itself becomes threatening because he is not negotiating from uncertainty. The criminals do not yet understand what they are dealing with. That is their first mistake. The second is assuming that fear is the same thing as power. Vincent Quaranta and his criminal hierarchy operate through intimidation. They believe people obey because they are frightened. McCall gradually proves that obedience created by fear is fragile. A community can appear submissive while quietly waiting for someone to challenge the system. McCall becomes that challenge. His interventions also begin turning him into a local legend. People may not know his full identity, but they recognize that something has changed. The criminal presence that once seemed unavoidable is beginning to encounter resistance. Emma's investigation moves closer to the same truth. She sees the criminal organization from the perspective of intelligence and law enforcement. McCall sees it from the street. Their methods are different, but their objectives overlap. The difference is that Emma can leave the case. McCall cannot. The more deeply he becomes connected to the town, the more personal the conflict becomes. Eventually, the criminals begin threatening the people around him. That changes everything. There is a significant difference between McCall protecting strangers and McCall protecting people whose names he knows. Once the residents become emotionally real to him, the possibility of walking away disappears. The Camora's retaliation exposes the limits of his strategy. Eliminating individual criminals is not enough if the system itself remains intact. The problem is bigger than one thug. Bigger than one restaurant. Bigger than one frightened shopkeeper. The entire town has been trained to live under pressure. And McCall realizes that if he wants these people to become free, he cannot simply remove a few predators and disappear. He has to confront the hierarchy. That decision carries a cost. Every act of violence makes the possibility of peace more complicated. McCall is using the same language as the people he despises. The difference is his purpose, but purpose does not make violence clean. That moral contradiction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The criminals attack the community. Businesses suffer. Fear becomes visible. Spaces that once represented ordinary life become reminders of control. For McCall, this is personal. Not because he wants revenge in the traditional sense. Because he has begun to care. That may be his greatest vulnerability. The Camorra believes McCall is simply another enemy to eliminate. They do not understand that he is now emotionally invested in the town. And McCall himself may not fully understand it either. He has spent years protecting people and then leaving them behind. Here, leaving would mean abandoning something he has started to imagine as his own. The midpoint therefore shifts the story from a revenge narrative into a liberation narrative. McCall is no longer simply punishing criminals for what they have done. He is trying to make it possible for ordinary people to live without fear. That sounds noble. But it creates a dangerous question. How much violence can a man commit in the name of peace before the distinction between protector and predator begins to disappear? McCall knows the answer cannot be simple. He has killed too many people to pretend that he is innocent. His past follows him. Emma's investigation also helps reveal the scale of what McCall has become. To her, he is not simply an injured stranger in an Italian town. He is a man with a history, a person whose methods exist outside the boundaries of conventional justice. That contrast matters because Emma represents a world in which justice requires procedure. McCall represents a world in which procedure sometimes arrives too late. Neither perspective completely solves the problem. McCall's violence may save lives, but it cannot erase the moral cost of his methods. Emma's institutional approach may be slower, but it does not require her to become an executioner. Their connection therefore gives the film a subtle argument about justice itself. Who gets to decide what punishment is deserved? And what happens when the person making that decision has already accepted that he will live with blood on his hands? For McCall, the answer seems to be that he cannot become innocent. He can only choose what his violence serves. That is the idea the final act begins to test. The Camorra retaliates more aggressively, and the town becomes increasingly unstable. McCall's physical exhaustion becomes another part of the conflict. He is not simply fighting against enemies. He is fighting against the limits of his own body. The injuries he carries are visible evidence of accumulated consequences. Every fight reminds him that time is passing. His counting has always been about controlling time. Now time is controlling him. Still, he refuses to leave. That refusal is perhaps the clearest sign that the man who arrived in Italy is changing. The stranger is becoming a protector. The protector is becoming a resident. And the resident is beginning to understand that saving the town will require confronting the person at the top. Vincent Quaranta represents that final obstacle. His power is inherited, economic and psychological. He believes the town belongs to his organization because they have controlled it long enough to confuse ownership with authority. McCall sees the difference. A community cannot belong to the people who frighten it. The final confrontation therefore becomes inevitable. The town itself transforms into a battlefield. Familiar streets, buildings and spaces acquire new meaning. Places that once represented safety now contain danger. McCall moves through the environment with the same methodical precision he used at the winery, but the emotional context has changed completely. He is not fighting to escape. He is fighting to stay. The final sequence depends on the idea that McCall's greatest advantage remains his ability to observe. Darkness and confined spaces allow him to become almost invisible. The criminals are searching for a conventional enemy. But McCall refuses to fight conventionally. He studies. He waits. He counts. And then he acts. The violence becomes increasingly inevitable because Vincent has spent the entire film misunderstanding the nature of power. He believes power comes from controlling people. McCall understands that power can also come from protecting them. Vincent has employees who obey him because they are afraid. McCall earns loyalty from people who want him to remain. That difference becomes the moral dividing line between them. The final confrontation with Vincent therefore carries the structure of a classic Western duel, even though the circumstances are very different. The outsider has entered a community controlled by a local tyrant, and the tyrant has underestimated the stranger. McCall's physical limitations remain visible. He is not invincible. He is simply unwilling to stop. The countdown motif returns because McCall's relationship with time has always defined his combat style. He transforms chaos into sequence. He knows that if he can control the next few seconds, he can control the entire encounter. Vincent ultimately becomes trapped not only by McCall but by his own assumptions. He expects fear to protect him. It does not. He expects his hierarchy to remain loyal. It does not. He expects McCall to behave like an ordinary opponent. He does not. The final punishment is brutal, but its symbolic meaning is more important than its physical details. Vincent is destroyed by the same culture of violence he believed made him powerful. McCall survives. But survival is not the real resolution. The real resolution comes afterward. Emma and McCall share their final interaction, and the relationship between them reinforces the difference between institutional justice and personal justice. Emma understands enough about McCall to recognize what he has done, but the film does not require her to turn him into a conventional hero. He remains morally complicated. The town, however, sees something else. It sees the person who helped them. That acceptance becomes the emotional climax. McCall is no longer merely the stranger who arrived injured. He has become someone whose presence matters. He has entered the community. The ending is deliberately quieter than the violence that preceded it. There is no need for a massive celebration. McCall has not conquered an empire. He has done something much smaller and, for him, much more difficult. He has stayed. That decision changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The Equalizer finally finds a place where balance does not mean destroying someone. It means helping ordinary people reclaim their lives. And for a man who has spent decades moving through the world as a weapon, being accepted by people who do not need him to kill anyone may be the closest thing to victory he has ever experienced. Part 4. Character Analysis. Robert McCall is compelling because his surface goal and internal goal are never exactly the same. On the surface, he wants to protect innocent people. Underneath that, he wants forgiveness. And perhaps the person he most desperately wants forgiveness from is himself. McCall's obsession with order reveals how deeply he fears chaos. His routines, his books, his watch, his food, and his counting are not random personality traits. They are systems of control. He has built a world in which uncertainty can be reduced to observation and timing. He studies people because people are unpredictable. But he believes behavior can be understood. That belief is part of what makes him so effective and also part of what keeps him isolated. If every human interaction becomes something to analyze, then genuine participation becomes difficult. McCall is always watching. The Italian town gradually forces him to stop watching and start participating. His relationship with food is especially revealing. Eating is normally one of the most ordinary human activities. It implies comfort, routine, and social connection. McCall's attention to meals and restaurants allows the film to show him encountering a form of life that has nothing to do with missions. He can sit at a table without having to calculate who will attack him. At least, that is what he wants. His history as an assassin complicates every attempt at peace. McCall has killed people who deserved punishment and people whose deaths served missions that were part of a larger system. The film never allows us to believe that he can simply erase that history. This is why his morality is different from innocence. McCall is not innocent. He is trying to become useful in a different way. That distinction makes his relationship with violence so interesting. He does not appear addicted to violence in the conventional sense. He does not enjoy chaos for its own sake. What he seems addicted to is the feeling that his skills can produce an immediate moral result. Someone is suffering. He intervenes. Someone is threatening the vulnerable. He stops them. The simplicity of that equation gives him purpose. But it also creates a trap. If violence is the only tool through which McCall can feel morally useful, then peace could make him feel unnecessary. That is why the Italian town is so important. It offers him another kind of usefulness. He can be present. He can listen. He can accept help. He can become familiar. He can be a person rather than a function. The doctor becomes important because he treats McCall without needing anything from him. He does not ask the legendary assassin to save him. He simply saves McCall. That reversal is emotionally significant. For perhaps one of the first times in his life, McCall is the vulnerable person. And he survives because someone else chooses compassion. That experience begins changing his understanding of what protection means. Emma offers another perspective. She represents the world McCall has left behind, the world of intelligence agencies, investigations, and official authority. Their shared history creates emotional shorthand, but the more important contrast is philosophical. Emma works within a system. McCall works around it. She needs information. He needs conviction. She can investigate the criminal organization. McCall can confront the people making the investigation necessary. The film never fully resolves which method is superior because the real point is that McCall is not trying to become an ordinary law enforcement officer. He has already crossed too many lines. His redemption therefore cannot come from becoming innocent again. It has to come from choosing what his accumulated abilities will accomplish. This is where the title becomes more meaningful. To equalize means to restore balance. But McCall's life has never been balanced. He has spent years moving between violence and isolation. He protects others while remaining emotionally separate from them. He saves people without allowing them to save him. The Italian town interrupts that pattern. It offers him the possibility of mutual belonging. The town does not need to know everything about him. It only needs to know who he is now. That is a powerful idea because it separates redemption from erasure. McCall cannot undo his past. He cannot become a man who never killed anyone. He cannot return to innocence. But he can decide what happens next. His aging body reinforces this theme. The injuries he receives are not simply obstacles placed in front of an action hero. They are reminders that McCall cannot continue forever. Every wound is a receipt for his previous life. The character therefore becomes more interesting as he becomes physically weaker. His power is no longer based entirely on invulnerability. It is based on accumulated knowledge. He knows where violence leads. He knows what criminals fear. He knows how systems of intimidation function. And perhaps, finally, he knows what he wants to protect. The greatest question is whether McCall truly achieves redemption. The film wisely avoids giving a completely clean answer. If redemption means becoming innocent, then no. If redemption means using the person you became to create something better than the life that created you, then perhaps. That uncertainty is what gives the ending its emotional resonance. McCall does not become a different human being. He becomes a different version of the same human being. He remains dangerous. He simply finds a reason to make that danger serve something other than his own guilt. The villains surrounding him are much simpler. Vincent Quaranta is not designed to compete with McCall psychologically. He is designed to represent a form of power that McCall rejects. Vincent believes control is ownership. If people obey him, he believes he has earned their respect. But fear is not respect. It is temporary compliance. His criminal hierarchy depends on the assumption that people will continue obeying because they have no alternative. McCall introduces an alternative. That is why Vincent fundamentally misunderstands him. He assumes McCall wants power. McCall wants balance. He assumes McCall wants territory. McCall wants freedom. He assumes violence will frighten McCall. McCall has already spent a lifetime living with violence. The difference between them is therefore not that one man uses violence and the other does not. Both men use violence. The difference is what violence means to them. Vincent uses it to possess. McCall uses it, however imperfectly, to release. That distinction is the moral foundation of the film. Vincent also lacks genuine loyalty. The people around him remain because they fear the consequences of leaving. McCall gradually inspires loyalty without demanding it. That contrast explains why the supporting characters matter so much. Giorgio and the doctor are not merely plot devices. They represent normality. Their lives are built around routines rather than domination. Restaurants, cafes, and public spaces become emotional architecture. The town feels alive because people use it. They talk. They eat. They work. They complain. They laugh. They worry. That ordinary behavior is exactly what McCall has been missing. Emma provides the institutional counterweight, while the residents provide the emotional one. Together, they show McCall three different ways of belonging: through duty, through community, and through personal responsibility. His final decision becomes believable because the town has gradually stopped being scenery. It has become a character. And that character has, in a sense, adopted him. Part 5. Themes: Symbolism. At the center of the Equalizer 3 is a question that sounds simple but becomes increasingly difficult the longer we examine it. Can violence ever become redemption? McCall's life suggests that violence is both his greatest sin and his most useful instrument. That contradiction is never completely resolved. He kills because he believes certain people deserve to be stopped. But the film understands that the act of killing does not become morally clean simply because the target is evil. McCall may equalize the situation, but he does so through methods that remain deeply violent. This is why the idea of redemption is more complicated than revenge. Revenge looks backward. Redemption looks forward. Revenge asks what someone deserves because of what they did. Redemption asks what you will do with what you have become. McCall increasingly moves toward the second question. He cannot undo his past. He cannot restore the lives he has taken. What he can control is where his abilities go from here. That is why the town becomes such a powerful symbol of community versus isolation. McCall has spent years moving alone. His loneliness is not accidental. It is partly self-imposed because connection creates vulnerability. If people know you, they can hurt you. If people depend on you, they can become targets. If you belong somewhere, leaving becomes painful. Isolation protects McCall from those possibilities. But it also prevents him from living. The Italian town offers the opposite philosophy. Community requires exposure. You become visible. People learn your habits. They know where you eat. They notice when you are absent. For McCall, that visibility is frightening because his survival has always depended on being difficult to find. Yet it is precisely that visibility that gives him the chance to become something other than an anonymous weapon. Aging strengthens this theme. McCall is not afraid simply because his body is weaker. He is afraid because time is becoming impossible to ignore. His counting has always been a way of controlling time. But an older McCall knows that no amount of precision can stop the clock. The character is therefore confronting mortality in a way the earlier films could avoid. He cannot keep doing this forever. Eventually, the question has to become what kind of life he wants to have before the violence stops being possible. That makes his desire for peace deeply emotional. Peace is not just the absence of enemies. It is the presence of something worth living for. Guilt functions as McCall's invisible antagonist. No criminal can physically attack it because guilt lives inside him. The Camorra can threaten the town, but they cannot create the emptiness McCall already carries. That emptiness existed before Italy. The town simply gives him a reason to confront it. The movie also explores the fantasy of second chances. Popular action cinema often presents redemption as a dramatic final sacrifice. A violent hero dies saving someone and suddenly his past is transformed into meaning. The Equalizer 3 chooses a quieter possibility. McCall survives. He stays. He is accepted. His second chance is not death. It is life. That makes the ending more unusual than it first appears. The visual symbolism reinforces these ideas. Southern Italy is photographed as a place of warmth and openness. The architecture, streets, sunlight and ocean create a visual world that seems almost too beautiful for the violence taking place inside it. That contrast is intentional in effect even when it is not announced. Blood looks more shocking against bright walls. Gunfire feels more disruptive in peaceful streets. Violence becomes visually incompatible with the environment. And that incompatibility mirrors McCall's internal condition. He wants to belong to this peaceful world, but he carries violence with him. Churches and religious imagery add another layer. McCall's journey resembles a secular version of confession. He has no simple ritual through which he can erase his sins. Instead, he repeatedly confronts situations in which he has to decide what kind of person he wants to be. The religious atmosphere of the town therefore creates an interesting background for a character who behaves like judge, jury, and executioner. McCall is effectively creating his own moral court. But the film never tells us that his judgment is perfect. That ambiguity is important. Doors and thresholds also become natural symbols in a story about belonging. McCall begins as someone standing outside. He watches through windows. He enters spaces temporarily. He leaves before relationships can become permanent. A door can separate him from danger, but it can also separate him from community. A window allows observation without participation. McCall is comfortable behind glass. The town slowly pulls him out from behind it. Food provides another visual and emotional symbol. A meal is not a mission. A meal is an ordinary human experience. People sit together and share time. That is exactly what McCall has rarely allowed himself. The cafe becomes almost a miniature version of the community itself. It is public, social, and repetitive. People return because it belongs to their routine. McCall begins developing a routine of his own. That routine may be the first sign that he is no longer simply passing through. Clocks and countdowns represent the opposite side of this development. McCall counts because counting gives him certainty. The world can be chaotic, but numbers feel stable. 1 second becomes another. One movement follows another. One threat becomes one decision. Yet the town introduces something that cannot be counted. Belonging. You cannot calculate the value of a conversation. You cannot measure the emotional importance of being recognized. You cannot reduce community to a number. That is perhaps why McCall's greatest transformation is not tactical. It is emotional. The streets that once represented unfamiliar territory become familiar. The darkness in which he fights criminals contrasts with the daylight in which ordinary people live. His wounds remain visible reminders that his old identity has consequences. And the final imagery gains meaning because the visual world around McCall has changed from somewhere he merely occupies into somewhere he recognizes. The deeper Western analogy makes this even clearer. McCall is the wandering gunslinger. He arrives from outside. The community is under the control of a powerful criminal force. The locals are frightened. The outsider intervenes. The tyrant is defeated. But classic westerns often end with the gunslinger riding away. The Equalizer 3 reverses that expectation. McCall stays. That is the film's most important departure from the mythology of the wandering hero. The Western gunslinger usually cannot belong because violence has made him an outsider. McCall discovers that belonging might still be possible if the meaning of his violence changes. The contradiction remains. He uses violence to create peace. That is morally uncomfortable. But the movie's argument is not that violence becomes pure. It is that purpose matters. McCall's body becomes a metaphor for the price of his past. His injuries are not merely physical. They are accumulated history made visible. Every wound tells the audience that his former life has a cost. The equalizer concept itself becomes philosophical. To equalize means to restore balance between predator and victim. McCall steps into situations where power has become unfairly distributed. Criminals have money. They have weapons. They have institutional fear. Ordinary people have very little. McCall changes the equation. But he does so by becoming a different kind of powerful figure. The movie's unresolved moral question is whether that is enough. Can someone become a protector without remaining a killer? Maybe not completely. And that is why the ending does not present McCall as purified. The town's acceptance is more meaningful because it does not require innocence. It represents social redemption rather than moral absolution. McCall is not forgiven by the universe. He is welcomed by people. Those are different things. And perhaps that is all he ever needed. Part 6, Production Breakdown. Because The Equalizer 3 is live action rather than animated, its visual effects are most interesting when considered as part of a larger visual filmmaking system: cinematography, production design, practical action, stunt choreography, editing and selective effects working together to make McCall's world feel tangible. Robert Richardson's cinematography gives the movie a strong cinematic identity. The wide composition allows the Italian environment to exist as more than background decoration. The landscape has room to breathe, and that breathing space becomes important because the movie constantly contrasts stillness with sudden violence. A peaceful street can remain quiet for an extended period. Then McCall enters it. The camera often allows us to observe before the action arrives. This is consistent with McCall's own psychology. He watches the world, and the film invites us to watch with him. That observational quality separates the Equalizer 3 from action films that rely almost entirely on rapid cutting and constant motion. McCall's action scenes are built around anticipation. The audience sees objects. We see spaces. We see exits. We see the environment. Then we realize McCall has been seeing all of it too. This is why ordinary objects become so important. A room is not merely a room. It is a collection of potential weapons and tactical advantages. A table can become leverage. A wall can become a trap. A narrow corridor can become an advantage. A tool can become an instrument of violence. The effect is to make McCall appear less like a superhero and more like a person who understands physical environments at an almost impossible level. The violence also feels heavier because the movie allows physical consequences to remain visible. Blood matters. Injuries matter. Breathing matters. The audience is reminded that bodies are fragile. That becomes especially important because McCall himself is aging. If he were filmed like a superhero, his injuries would become temporary visual effects. Instead, they become part of the story. The editing by Conrad Buff helps shape the rhythm of those moments. Action is not simply about speed. It is about timing. McCall's methodical pace before violence creates a contrast with the sudden acceleration of the attack itself. The audience waits. McCall decides. Then everything happens. This creates the sensation that violence is not random but inevitable once the decision has been made. The Italian locations also contribute enormously to the film's atmosphere. The production design has to make the town feel lived in rather than constructed solely as a battleground. Restaurants, homes, cafes, streets, and public spaces need to suggest decades of ordinary human activity. That is what allows the community to become emotionally credible. If the town felt like a generic action movie set, McCall's decision to remain would not matter. Instead, the environment feels specific. That specificity gives the final decision weight. The film's effects work best when they support rather than dominate the imagery. The movie does not need superhero-level spectacle because McCall's fantasy is grounded in human physicality. That grounding is one of the franchise's greatest visual strengths. Antoine Fuqua's direction is similarly based on restraint. Fuqua understands the value of patience. He allows McCall to sit. He allows him to look. He allows a scene to breathe before violence erupts. That rhythm creates a psychological tension that louder action films sometimes lose. The silence itself becomes threatening. A close-up of Denzel Washington's face can communicate more than a page of dialogue because Washington plays McCall as someone who rarely reveals the full calculation happening behind his eyes. The director can therefore use the actor's stillness as part of the action design. Denzel does not need to shout that McCall is dangerous. The audience already knows. That creates an interesting reversal. In many action films, the hero becomes powerful when the camera makes him look larger. Here, McCall often becomes powerful when the camera lets him remain small and quiet inside a larger environment. The Italian setting strengthens that effect. The wide landscapes make McCall look almost insignificant. Then the story reveals that the quiet stranger standing in the corner may be the most dangerous person in the entire town. Fuqua's use of atmosphere also explains why the Equalizer 3 sometimes feels more like a character drama than a conventional action sequel. Long stretches of recovery and observation are not simply delays between fights. They are necessary because the film needs McCall to experience ordinary life. Without those quiet moments, his final decision would feel purely functional. The collaboration between Fuqua and Washington is especially effective because both understand that McCall works through contradiction. He is calm but violent. He is compassionate but lethal. He wants isolation but craves belonging. He is physically vulnerable but psychologically formidable. The direction does not try to resolve these contradictions too quickly. Instead, it lets them coexist. That is what makes the action feel connected to character rather than simply inserted for entertainment. Part 7, Music Sound. Marcelo Zarvos's score plays an important role in separating McCall's internal world from the physical world around him. The music often works through restraint rather than constant emotional instruction. Instead of telling the audience exactly what to feel at every moment, the score creates an atmosphere in which observation becomes suspense. That is particularly important for McCall because his most dramatic moments often happen before he acts. He watches. He thinks. He decides. Music can turn those apparently ordinary actions into moments of anticipation. The quieter passages during his recovery also matter because they allow the character's vulnerability to exist without being buried beneath action music. McCall is not always calculating his next kill. Sometimes he is simply healing. That contrast creates emotional space. The Italian environment also influences the sound of the film. The atmosphere is not built entirely through dialogue. Public spaces contain their own musicality, voices, movement, restaurant activity, footsteps, distant traffic, and everyday conversation. These sounds create a sense of life. And because the audience becomes accustomed to that life, sudden silence becomes meaningful. Silence before violence can feel louder than music. McCall's relationship with sound is also consistent with his heightened perception. He notices details that other people ignore, and the sound design can make the audience feel as though we are experiencing the world through his attention. Footsteps matter. Breathing matters. A weapon being handled matters. A door opening matters. The soundscape turns ordinary movement into information. During confrontations, impact sounds are allowed to feel physical. That matters because McCall's fighting style depends on consequences. When he hits someone, the audience should feel that the body has actually absorbed the force. This prevents the violence from becoming entirely abstract. His own breathing becomes particularly significant as his physical limitations increase. The older McCall is still extraordinarily capable, but the sound of exertion reminds us that capability has a cost. The criminal environment creates a different sound profile. There is intimidation, aggression, raised voices, threatening movement. The contrast between that noise and McCall's relative quietness reinforces the difference between his personality and the world he enters. He does not need to compete for volume. His silence is part of his authority. The final confrontation benefits from this philosophy because the soundscape becomes increasingly focused. The environment narrows. Movement becomes clearer. Every sound feels like information. The audience begins listening for what McCall is hearing. That is one of the most effective ways sound can support character. It does not simply make the action louder. It makes the protagonist's perception part of the storytelling. And when the violence ends, the return of ordinary environmental sound becomes emotionally important. The town is still there. People are still living. The world has not transformed into a battlefield permanently. That return to normality is part of McCall's victory. The violence was temporary. The community remains. Part 8: Cultural Impact. The immediate response to The Equalizer 3 reflected a familiar pattern for mature action franchises. Audiences already knew what Denzel Washington's return meant. They expected McCall's calculated brutality, his controlled dialogue, and his ability to make criminals regret underestimating him. The film delivered those expectations. But it also surprised audiences by giving the character a warmer emotional environment. The Italian setting became one of the movie's most recognizable features. It allowed promotional material to sell the film as something visually distinct while maintaining the franchise's established identity. The violence generated conversation as well. The Equalizer series has always leaned into the cathartic fantasy of seeing corrupt people receive consequences, and the third film continues that tradition with some extremely graphic moments. For fans, that brutality is part of the attraction. For critics of the franchise, it can raise questions about the morality of celebrating execution as justice. Both reactions are understandable. The film's appeal depends partly on the audience knowing that McCall will do things ordinary people cannot or will not do. That fantasy becomes especially powerful in a world where viewers may feel that systems of justice are slow, complicated, or ineffective. McCall represents immediate consequences. But the film also asks us to notice the cost. Denzel Washington's age became part of the conversation because McCall's physical vulnerability is impossible to ignore. Instead of pretending that age does not matter, the film incorporates it into the character. That choice helps explain why younger viewers can still connect with him. McCall is not a fantasy of youth. He is a fantasy of accumulated competence. He represents the idea that experience can become its own form of power. The reunion between Washington and Dakota Fanning also generated nostalgia. Audiences familiar with Man on Fire immediately understood the emotional association, even though Emma and McCall are not simply reproductions of their earlier characters. The casting functions almost like cinematic memory. The film also benefited from the simplicity of its premise. A complicated action plot is not always necessary when the audience is invested in the protagonist. The Equalizer 3 demonstrates how familiarity can become a strength when the character remains compelling. At the same time, that familiarity produces the film's biggest criticism. The story is not radically innovative. The villains are not deeply layered. The structure is recognizable. The audience knows that McCall is going to confront the criminals. The question is how satisfying the journey will be. For many viewers, the answer was positive because the film delivers the pleasures they came for while adding enough emotional material to make the experience feel warmer than expected. Its long-term value therefore lies less in reinventing the action genre and more in reinforcing a particular type of mature action protagonist. McCall belongs to the same broad cultural family as John Wick, Brian Mills, and the protagonist of Nobody. Older or experienced figures whose apparent normality conceals extraordinary capability. But McCall differs in one important respect. His story is increasingly about belonging. John Wick is often pulled deeper into a violent world. McCall is trying to escape one. That difference makes the Equalizer 3 particularly relevant to the aging action hero trend. The older protagonist is no longer simply proving that he can still fight. He is asking what fighting is worth. The franchise also has a strong connection to Denzel Washington's larger cultural identity. Washington has never depended entirely on action star mythology. His screen presence carries dramatic credibility, and that credibility makes McCall feel more substantial than a generic vigilante. He does not play the character as a cartoon. He plays him as a man. That is why the franchise has remained recognizable. Fans remember the counting. They remember the methods. They discuss how long McCall takes to calculate a room. They debate his most creative interventions.